I want to talk to you today about a very simple but powerful way to reprogram some of your mental programming, or your neurological programming. So let's start first with how the programs actually get established. So when we experiencing life, we experience life through our senses. And that sensory information, so if it's sight, for example, then, well, that's light reflecting off objects and hitting the retina at the back of the eye, which then converts that light into, through the receptors on the retina, converts that into an impulse, a neurological impulse that travels along the optic nerve to the brain. The same would be true for all of our other senses in different ways. So we're experiencing life through our senses, and that is raw sensory information. So then the brain, and it's literally ones and zeros. It's a way to think about it. So what does that mean? Ones and zeros means nothing. We've got to be able to make sense of what that is. Otherwise we can't interact and engage with our world. And so this is where the brain is a meaning-making device. And so what the brain then does is it starts to look for patterns. The first thing we decide is what we choose to focus on. And what we choose to focus on or pay attention to, it will determine which of that sensory information we actually process in the brain and which of it we delete. So we actually don't process most of the information coming through our senses, which is interesting, which means that it's very significant what you choose to pay attention to. Okay, your focus. We don't experience life; we experience the life we focus on. So, what part of that sensory information are you actually processing? And then once we take that bit of information that we decide to process, now the brain starts to look for patterns. And to do this, of course, it's going based on historical insight. So have I seen something like this before? Does this look familiar or similar to anything that I've experienced before? And this is called generalizing and distorting. We start to take that sensory information and we start to shift it and twist it and generalize it and distort it so that it makes sense to us. It fits with something that we already know, which is interesting. So now we've got this very much manipulated perception of what our senses actually experienced. And in that process, what starts to happen through our lives is that is the process of creating maps. Or, in some cases, updating maps, adding new information to a map. So let's talk about maps for a moment. A map is not the territory, it is a representation of the territory. Similarly, our meaning that we've attached to a particular situation we're experiencing through our senses isn't the true situation, it's a representation of it, it's a perception of it. And the more accurate the map represents the territory, the better. But that's not true for all of us. Sometimes our maps really don't represent the territory well. So each time we're experiencing life, what happens? Let's say you've got a fear, because a fear is also a map. Fears, beliefs, all this programming in the brain are really just maps. Now, let's think about this for a second. A map, the purpose of a map is to help you navigate that particular territory. So if you're going to the UK, well, then you would want to probably get maps for the UK. In the old days, it was get the physical maps, and today it's Google Maps, and you would then access those Google Maps to navigate that territory. All right, so now let's think about that. So if you think of the world map, that would probably be a good way to think about our worldview. So we have this overarching worldview, and that would be, what are your beliefs about life as a whole? What are your beliefs about the world as a whole? Someone might have a belief about life, that life is meaningful and purposeful and it's all about growth. That would be quite close to mine, perhaps. Someone else would be, their worldview might be, life is meaningless, should I say, and we're just here to, live for a certain number of years and die, and then we return to dust, and that's it. And there could be endless maps for that. Now, that's the world map. Now, that world map, that world view, then shapes and influences and frames every other map, no matter how much detail you drill down into. So from the world, then you go into continents. And maybe the continents, the maps you have for continents would be maps for the big areas of your life. Maybe relationships is one. Maybe health is another one. Maybe your career or your vocation is another one, etc. So you might have, we've got 7 continents. You might have, a similar sort of number of major areas in your life. And then that map for that continent would represent what are your beliefs about that area. So if it's relationships, what are your fundamental overarching global beliefs about relationships? You might say, well, you know what, relationships are what makes life meaningful. Someone else might say relationships are just a source of pain. Eventually you're going to get hurt. And again, there's endless variations and interpretations of those. So that would be your overarching map for relationships. And then you drill down into the countries, okay? So maybe the countries would represent different types of relationships. So maybe one country's map would represent intimate relationships. Another country's map represents close friendships. Another country's map represents work relationships. Another country's map represents acquaintances. Another country's map represents new relationships. And so if you think about the different countries that make up a continent, if the continent is relationships, then the different countries might represent different types of relationships. And again, the map for each country or type of relationship would guide and determine your whole mindset, approach, and behavior towards those kinds of relationships. And then within the countries, now you've got provinces, okay? And so the provinces might start to represent subcategories of those types of relationships. Maybe it's specific people. And so you get the idea, right? As you're drilling down, you're getting more and more specific. Your maps are becoming more and more specific to certain conditions, certain circumstances, certain interactions. And those maps help you navigate and make sense of what you are experiencing. So if you have a fear for snakes, all right, then there's a map that you have created in the brain, which is literally wiring up a neural network in the brain. You're literally connecting neurons when you create the map. So if I'm sitting here and I have a fear for snakes and a snake starts to slither out of the grass, what do? I see that sensory information comes through, it registers in the brain, processes in the brain, I pull out the appropriate map, and maybe my map says, get the hell out of here because snakes equal danger or death. Somebody else might have a map that says snakes are very interesting and lovely creatures. And so those two different maps would cause each person to respond completely differently to that snake. So I think hopefully that gives you a good understanding of how our maps work. But I said maps are neural networks. Now think about a neural network in the same way you'd think of a live electrical circuit. If you've got a live electrical circuit, when you're wiring up a circuit, you're literally connecting wires. so that the current can travel along that circuit. If there's a break in that circuit, and this is what a switch is, if there's a break in that circuit, it stops the current from flowing. So when you create maps, what you're doing is you are creating a pathway for that live electrical energy to travel along. Now the difference with our electrical system, meaning our nervous system, which is really just an electrical system in many respects, is the difference is that we have a chemical component. So where our nerve cells join is at the synapse. And at the synapse, where two nerve cells join, in that synapse we've got neurotransmitters that take the electrical impulse that's traveled along the nerve cell, it changes into a chemical process and then crosses that synaptic gap, as it's called, and changes back into an electrical impulse. So the simple thing here is that we have chemistry in our electrical system, a chemical component. And that chemical component is what causes physiological shifts in the body. And ultimately that plays into behavior. So if I've pulled up the map because I see a snake and I pulled up the fear map, right, then because there's now live current traveling along that neurological network, I'm using the map to navigate. It's firing certain wiring in the brain and the nervous system as a whole, and releasing cortisol and adrenaline, perhaps. Cortisol being the stress response and adrenaline being the fight or flight response. And these, as an example, will have physiological responses in the body. Heart rate picks up, the breathing changes, the body starts to release energy to mobilize me into action, etc., etc., etc. Okay, now the next part of this is that the stories we tell ourselves, the language we use. Anytime you language something, I don't like snakes, snakes are horrible, okay? Then, or relationships, you just get hurt if you open yourself up. You got to look after yourself. Somebody else's language or story might be, relationships are the most wonderful thing because you can experience real openness and incredible trust and intimacy with somebody when you really commit. And the stories we tell ourselves are like the audiobook version of the map. They are the verbalization of the map. That's why in neuro-linguistic programming, when you listen to somebody's language and their language patterns, the stories they say, the repetitive language they say in certain areas, you can start to understand their map, how they've wired themselves up. So now, maps need to be updated. Sometimes I come across people who have had maybe a very intense experience at some point, and they have created a map, and like one guy, for example, he was quite a small guy, and I was trying to teach him to speak publicly and effectively, and it just wasn't working because he was speaking too fast and his voice, there was no variation in his voice. And eventually he said, because I was trying to get him to slow down, and eventually he said, I can't slow down because when I was little, I was small and I had to fight with my voice. And I said to him, well done, because now what you've done is you've uncovered a map. You've made a map that was unconscious, conscious. And so you wired up the map that you have to fight through your voice. You can change that now because there was a decision you made when you were much younger. And you made it from a limited perspective. So when you change your story, what you do is you actually start to rewire the map. You start to update the map. So when you become conscious of your stories, you might start to say, hey, hold on, I don't believe that anymore. Or that's not helpful for me anymore. One of the stories that I grew up with was, if you want to do things yourself, be independent. Okay, but there was some positives to that, because it developed self-reliance, but it got to a point where it started to become an inhibitor. Because if I be independent and only do everything myself, how do I ever collaborate? How do I ever build something, develop something that requires more than just my effort? And so I had to start changing the map to say, hold on, actually it's about collaboration. When we collaborate, we can achieve more. And when you start to change your story, you actually start to rewire the map. You start to update and change the map. And so it's very important to become aware of what are the stories you keep telling yourself about certain things in certain situations. And where does that map sit? You know, is it sitting at a country level? Is it sitting at a city level? Is it sitting at a continent level? Is it sitting at a world map level? Sometimes we need to rewire the map about our whole world view. Sometimes we need to change our story about a big area of our lives, like relationships. And this is the empowering part, is that you can change the map simply by changing your narrative about it. Because the narrative is the audiobook version of the map. And when you change the story, you start to rewire the map. And that means you're actually starting to change biochemistry. So I hope you found this helpful. I certainly find recording these videos when I've thought about something that in a more simplistic way, and I'm always looking for more simple, clear, practical ways of explaining these concepts, because I find that when you do, it's easier for people to grasp them and do something with them. If you like this video, please leave a comment. If you've got questions, please leave a comment. Please, if you like the videos that I share, please subscribe. It really does help me feel like what I'm sharing is being received and adding value that is encouraging for me. And I've also released a book. I've finally written my first book after many years, and incorporates a lot of the principles that I talk about in these videos. And the book is called There's a Reason You Are Here. And it is a book that leads you on a path to understanding and clarifying your purpose. So the book is both storytelling, so you'll follow two characters in the story, as well as principles and reflection exercises that engage you to really make the changes as we go through the book. You can find my book on Amazon. There's a Reason You Are Here by Gavin Lund, of course. So if you search for either of those, you should be able to find it. You can either order the Kindle version or the paperback version.